that disagree with us. And I found it was very useful. He talks about the one thing he actually talks about intellectual humility. He says people on the left may be getting a little bit full of themselves because of thinking that they were right during most of the Trump presidency, and then after this election, and also I would say also because things seem to be going fairly well for the new Biden administration, so it's easy to to become full of yourself. And he argues for intellectual humility because when you are you're acting triumphantly, you're probably just as likely to turn people off as to bring them over to your side. So it talks about communicating directly with people, getting more deeply into the nuances of issues, getting people to see that there are different points of view, or at least different ways to view an issue, and listening, and being mindful, and all that. And and all that was very good, except I guess I'm down with all that. But on the other hand, this goes back to Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high. And that's great, except, when one side is actively trying to, change the rules of elections, when one side assaults the Congress, up until, even today, I hear liberals, saying, well, why is it that we have to turn the other cheek? The other side does what it wants. They play hardball. They play hardball with Merrick Garland, who's now Attorney General, but was appointed to be a Supreme Court justice. They played hardball with the Supreme Court. And we just, we do nothing. And now that we're in charge, we ought to do things like pack the Supreme Court. We ought to admit the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as states. We ought to end the filibuster. We ought to pass H.R. 1, which locks in place a lot of the changes in election law this past year and expands access. So, I don't know how to reconcile the two. Of being humble, listening, trying to bridge the divide, but at the same time, actively combating actions that are frankly anti-democratic.
So I'm sure you weren't, well, let me ask you this. Were you surprised by Christoph's approach to this? I'm sure you've read him often. Were you surprised at his appeal to humility?
No, I'm not surprised at him. And he's been writing some really interesting columns lately, sort of looking for issues that or approaches that people aren't either aware of, and of course he's well known for his work and sort of missionary work, actually, in Africa.
Right.
He just wrote about sort of the absence of public bathrooms. It's it's hard to he says it's hard to find a place to go, but which on the one hand is I don't know, maybe off-putting to some people, but on the other hand, it's speaking more generally to the decline of this idea of collective goods or public good, whether it's in education, whether it's privatizing prisons, the idea of voting as a public good, as opposed to your access to vote is going to depend on where you live and your social status. So I enjoy his work, but as I say, this latest column just kind of seems to be going against the conventional wisdom in liberal circles.
he mentions that Biden seems to be taking more of this track than some of the other progressives in the party. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think he's done a very skillful job of trying to, at least sound rhetorically, sound like someone who's reasonable, centrist, certainly left of center, but someone who hasn't gone, completely off. Some would say go completely off the deep end. Although, Medicare for all or a $15 minimum wage is hardly seems radical to me. But at any rate, he's positioned himself in such a way that, he appears to be reasonable. He certainly is. Certainly has gone out of his way to appear professional, hardworking. We haven't heard a whole lot from him. We're just going to hear from him tonight for the first time in a nationwide address since he's been inaugurated. So just sort of nose to the grindstone. And at the same time, he's pursuing some liberal policies. This $2 trillion COVID relief plan that with an expanded tax credit that would go a long way if it were made permanent toward eliminating child poverty. He's got more plans and ideas up his sleeve. It's unfortunate that it had to be passed with a completely partisan majority, but that I think tells you more about where the Republicans are than it does about his approach.
So Fletcher, do you see him, you're offering some skepticism about Christoph's approach, but you seem to be embracing Biden's direction here, or do you think he's gone soft on, he's taking too much, he's being too little in terms of aggressiveness?
Right now, I think what's been working for him is he's appearing as the anti-Trump, right? Mm-hmm. Experienced people around him. He himself has been around the block many times. He's, of course, a lot of these people are people who served in the Obama administration. So he has that connection. On the one hand, it's sort of like the third Obama term, but on the other hand, he has, the country has, moved on a number of issues, things like police violence, and he wants to respond to that. He wants to do things on his own that actually are efforts to try to correct mistakes that Obama made.
So my memory is that you've always been someone who's very concerned about civic engagement, civil society, community, and so on. Mm-hmm. So given what Christoph has said, where do you place his concerns next to what has been a concern of yours? I mean, is this a long-term, maybe it's a short-term loss to take this approach of Christoph, but is it a long-term win, or do you think it's a lose-lose to take Christoph's approach?
Well, I guess it depends on your perception of where the country is and where it's going. And there's sort of an ongoing dispute in political science about whether, we've become kind of a permanently polarized society, or the polarization is more at the elite level, and people themselves, are not that political. They're not that ideological. They don't follow current events all the time, except if you've got a president that's constantly demanding attention. And I guess, I tend to fall on the polarization end of things, especially, around those who follow government. And, there's always going to be a hard core of people, left, right, and any direction, who are going to be beyond persuasion. I do believe that the Republican Party, and I'm not the first to say this, has radicalized itself with on social issues, cultural issues, racial issues, identifying with conspiracy theories, denying obvious facts, believing that Trump actually won the election, adhering to a cult of personality. I don't know what to say to them. I do think, though, there are a number of Republicans, never Trumpers, and others who, remember the Republican Party as it used to be, a conservative party, but not necessarily an extreme party. And I think Biden believes that. I think, that there still are people out there who are persuadable and who at least will engage in civilized arguments. So, as I say, I don't know what to say to people who have succumbed to this, to the cult. But I do think that there are, many reasonable people out there on both sides. As you probably know, as I know my late colleague Wes McDonald and I used to have these dog and pony shows, and we'd go around the county and the Capitol debating issues. And he was, he was like a Pat Buchanan type Republican. People ask me what he would have thought about Trump, and I would say probably he would have loved Trumpism, but not necessarily loved Trump himself. So I kind of definitely missed him during the past few years, but we would, debate, and we would go hard at it. And there were a few, periods in our relationship where, we weren't sending each other Christmas cards or anything like that, but we always came back together. We always, were very civil, with each other. We were friends with each other, and, we could take a joke and, we just rib each other all the time. So, that seems like bygone days, but anyway, I still hope of those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, you probably heard Don Craybill, our colleague, talk about how Wes had missiles, models of missiles on his desk lined up, pointing Don's direction or something like that. So
yes,
Don, who of course is a pacifist.
Yes, indeed, and aimed right at Don, I'm sure. I remember.
Yes, yeah.
Anti-nuclear debates.
Yes, exactly. So
Wes was definitely pro-nuke.
It brings me to this question that was part of bringing you on. What was the appeal? Fletcher, how did we get here? I mean, I know it's a big question, but what's your sense? You followed politics in this country for a long time.
Wow. Obviously social media has a role in this, which offers people new opportunities to express themselves, listen to others with same viewpoints. We can assume different personae, right? I mean, we can tweet anonymously, or we can create whole new identities for ourselves. And of course, there are deeper pockets of the web where, very dark things are discussed. So that's part of it. And of course, I mean, my students that's the first thing they think of, because, well, they sort of live in it. But I think there are prior causes. I think one, I mean, you could go back to Reagan. We can see polarization effects then, definitely in the 90s with the Gingrich Congress and kind of his bomb throwing method of attacking Democratic leaders and President Clinton, and leading to his impeachment, continuing through the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, more or less an ideological divide, which has become, I just read about Lincoln's attitude toward war, and he was, even though he prosecuted or presided over the Civil War, he thought that he was also opposed to the Mexican War when he was a congressman. And, once a fight starts, it doesn't take long for people to forget the reasons why the fight started. War takes on, its own meaning. And very soon it degenerates into revenge and retaliation and revenge and retaliation. And so, I think the ideological war, and actually, when you think about it, like Clinton was not the most liberal presidents. I mean, the ideological divide was not that great back in the 90s. It became wider, I think, during the W years, and certainly with the Tea Party's reaction to Obama's presidency, it became wider. But as we get into the Trump presidency, it becomes revenge and retaliation. Some would go all the way back to the rejection of Robert Bork, as a by the Democratic Senate back in the late 80s. And what we're doing with Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, that's just, Democrats are just getting, a taste of their own medicine. So, it's kind of like lifted or detached itself, from real reality. It's all these imagined slights or things that happened 30 years ago. We look at, like Kosovo or Serbia, and starting wars over something that occurred like in 1387. Raising these, raising events, some anecdotally, to major causes, and I just think that's where we are now. We have a politics which has become, kind of like a meta politics, like that, as I say, has just severed itself from reality. That's where we are now.
So I was really struck by
Frankly,
your saying, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just really struck by your saying this is the equivalent, this parallels the way wars begin, or this parallels the dynamics of war.
Right.
That's what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I want to open it up for our audience for any questions that you might have for Dr. McClellan. Anyone want to raise a question or make a comment?
I'll jump in the water.
Go ahead, Tom.
From my perspective, I've become less and less political over the last few years as I take on more of an Anabaptist understanding, maybe, and maybe from the outsider point of view that I've tried to put myself in. I mean, I have opinions, and I want good governance. But I kind of get the feeling that both sides have really detached from reality. I mean, it's easy to look at QAnon and say those people are crazy. They've been unmoored. But I would say the same about some groups on the left, and it's those groups that tend to get the most coverage. I don't think our media is really helping the process by zooming in on Antifa and QAnon. It creates this us and them where it drives maybe a center right person farther right. It drives a center left person farther left because I want to be farther away from that.
Right.
And so where this article appeals to me is if we can be civil, we can find one another not all that far away from where we are.
Right. Well, I couldn't agree more. I think, first of all, the difference between dealing in abstractions and dealing, directly with people, and getting to understand their, where they're coming from. Just back to To Kill a Mockingbird, standing inside somebody's shoes. When Scout points out Mr. Cunningham and the mob that's about to lynch Tom Robinson, that sort of changes the whole context. He's now individualized, and in that case, shamed. So I think that's where it begins. I think there's sort of two things that are going on here in that the political science literature describes. One is negative partisanship, which is, and you hear this a lot, right? Negative partisanship is really not so much your attachment to your party, but loathing and hatred for the other party, and that's what motivates you. I mean, Trump does all these terrible things. I wish he wouldn't tweet so much, but he's better than Hillary Clinton, right? Or, you know, he's got his followers, but there's Antifa. And so it's not so much, so that's going on. And that's both sides. You know, anti-Trump, you know, anti-liberal. The other thing, though, is what is called asymmetric polarization. And, you know, and the literature seems to suggest that the Republicans have moved farther to the right than Democrats have moved to the left. And really the reason for that is if you have a distribution of the vote of the electorate, there are many more self-described conservatives than there are self-described liberals. And frankly, Democrats cannot forge a majority coalition in elections or even in Congress without some support from moderates. They just don't have the numbers. So they have to practice more of a coalition politics and also identity politics. Identity kind of sidesteps, you know, ideology. You know, you've got, you know, if you look at the Black vote or Latino vote, you know, those groups are not as liberal as you would think. Culturally, socially, they're actually pretty conservative. But if you talk about Black empowerment or Latino empowerment, then, you know, that helps bring them, that helps solidify their support for Democrats. But in any case, anyway, but there are, you know, there's a solid 40% of the electorate that are self-described conservatives. And they're probably even more intense about it. You know, they listen to or used to listen to Rush, follow Fox News, you know, websites galore, and you know, Second Amendment, anti-abortion. And so the strategy for them is not so much appealing to the other side. The strategy for them is to get out as much of their vote as they can. So, you know, politically, that's how you both negative partisanship and asymmetric polarization, you have sort of the way things are aligned now.
So it's not oranges and oranges or apples and apples. I mean, this has been very helpful. This distribution is different on, on either side. Okay.
Yeah, it explains a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Someone else, or were you going to respond, Thomas?
I wonder if some of the hot issues on the right are more hot. You mentioned abortion. You know,
yeah.
If you look at abortion as, you know, from a conservative perspective, it's going to be a bit more intense than looking at a $15 minimum wage from a liberal perspective.
Yeah. Well, that, you know, that's a good observation. And, you know, generally speaking, you know, when Democrats win, they're focusing on economic, you know, bread and butter issues. Clinton came in during a recession. Obama came in during the Great Recession. And Biden has come in during a pandemic-induced recession. And so preaching, you know, government intervention to put food on the table or to expand access to healthcare, that's when Democrats win. Republicans now have almost totally resorted to cultural issues, and that's when they usually win. You know, W obviously was had response to 9/11. Trump talking about immigration and race, and now as the Democrats are passing, you know, one of the largest social welfare bills ever, Republicans are talking about Dr. Seuss, and you know, the canceling of Pepe Le Pew, which you know, is sort of who was always been kind of a personal hero of mine. You know, that's all they have to say. I mean, that's sort of, but the idea is to sort of, you know, push buttons, whether they're, you know, racial or religious or cultural. And, you know, to me, I think that's not really engaging in issues. You're just trying to, you know, appeal to your own base as opposed to really, you know, engaging with the problems of the country.
Thank you, Fletcher. Someone else before we wrap up. Anyone?
I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to say what I wanted to say, formulate it into words. My question is, how do you think the mentalities have come into existence where people are now functioning the way that they're doing, responding to things and jumping on bandwagons? Is there a dynamic you could point to say this is where these mentalities developed, where now we can start behaving this way? Does that make any sense?
No, it certainly does, and I don't have a good response. If I were a psychologist, I might, but you know, I would observe that we've always had conspiracy mongers in American politics.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Richard Hofstadter, the famous historian back in the 40s and 50s, talking about the paranoia, the paranoid right, about anti-intellectualism, which appears, you know, on a regular basis in American politics. Back in the 60s, it was the John Birch Society. Now it's sort of like 3%ers. You know, the difference was that those groups were marginalized even within the Republican Party. And, you know, of course, it's also back in the day when the media wasn't as, you know, extreme, or didn't have the wide range of outlets that you have now, where people can simply ignore what the other side says. I mean, back in the day when we had when we had three major networks,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they would bring you the news about what was going on in Vietnam, and people would see it, and at least would have a common basis of facts, and then they could debate whether we ought to stay there or where we ought to leave. And we don't have that now. But we've always had extremists on all kinds of sides. And I think in one sense, you know, they may have gotten larger because of social media, but the main thing is they've gotten louder, and there's more coverage of them. They've been mainstreamed. And I guess my real concern is that when it takes over a major political party, you know, that's a constant threat. That's a constant threat to democracy. You know, democracy now is more or less, it's something we used to take for granted, but now it's an act of choice. Do we want to have a democratic society, or one that is more tolerant of authoritarianism and a more exclusive, has a more exclusive definition of democracy based on blood and ideology and culture instead of, shared civic ideals. We have one party that represents one pole of this, and the other, and that radicalized party, because it's one of the two major ones, can become the governing party at any time. In other countries, like a neo-Nazi party or a Tea Party, or a 3%er, Proud Boy party, they would be marginalized, as a minor party and, kind of a novelty. But here you've got one major party that has been captured, and, all it takes is a recession or Biden, committing, a series of gaffes or another pandemic. I mean, who knows? All it takes is some event, and that radicalized party becomes the governing party. And then, which we were very close to, I think, in this last election. I don't think Trump was going to move in a more liberal or tolerant direction for a second term. I have beachfront property in Arizona I'd like to sell you, if you think that. So we were very close to that. So that's what scares me. I mean, 2022, 2024, unless somehow the Republican Party straightens itself out, or there's internal support for a new kind of conservative party, or some kind of realignment, that's what kind of keeps me up at night.
Fletcher, thank you. Thank you for being with us. I think those of you in the audience now and later can recognize why I appreciate what Fletcher brings and how articulate you are, Fletcher, with these issues. Remind us again where you're writing every other week.
I write for the Pennsylvania Capital Star. It's on the web. It's a Harrisburg-based news organization, and that's where we find me about every couple of weeks, or whenever the mood strikes me.
Well, thank you. Thank you, audience, for being here. On Monday, Kevin Ressler, who is the United Way CEO and president, an advocate for racial justice, will be our guest. He's African-American and a great preacher, as he calls himself, sometime Mennonite pastor. So he'll be with us. And in a couple of weeks, David Brown, a colleague of both Fletcher and I, will be with us to look at Mike Luo's piece in the New Yorker, in which he talks about conspiracy theories and their link to the rise of the evangelical right. So we'll continue with some of these themes. Thank you, Fletcher. Thank you, all of you, for joining us, and peace.